All aboard! Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, football fans of all ages, I am Beast Mikey. You have now arrived at my train of thought. It's time to start asking the question. For all 32 NFL teams, where do we go from here? Now, as I've mentioned before, I'm going to do this a little differently. I'm going to do this by division, not by team. Where the previous years, I would do teams 2 by 2 in order of where you finished in conference. For example, I would have started with the Titans and the Giants, since you were the worst teams in your respective conferences, and gone from there. But this time, I'm going to do it a little differently. I think we'll get through things a little quicker, and we're going to talk about division by division. The first of which is going to be the NFC South. You were the only division not to have a representative in the divisional round. So let's get to business, and we're going to start with the team that finished last in this division. It was Carolina, but barely the Panthers. So let's talk about what Carolina did this year. They looked really terrible at first, and it looked like things were going to go really, really badly. They were going to have another hopeless season, and maybe even look towards the future where, sure, they'd have the number one pick in terms of their first round pick, but they would be needing it to get a quarterback of the future because Bryce Young wasn't it. As it turns out, the benching that was, and then the eventual return to the starting lineup after the issues with Andy Dalton would be one of the best things that happened to him. He started to get the system Dave Canales put in place. He started to find some sort of rapport with Xavier Legette, and Chuba Hubbard got paid during the season and looked like it. He looked really good down the stretch. Things were looking actually kind of productive for Bryce Young. Adam Thielen looked decent, and the Panthers' offense looked somewhat manageable. Now, the defense had some problems because of, honestly, injuries, and all of them to their main stars, i.e. Shaq Thompson, had a season-ending injury. Derek Brown, their best defensive player, had a season-ending injury. J.C. Horn had some issues with the injury bug. It was a pretty brutal time for all of the important Panther defensive players. Carolina's going to have to kind of sort of get that back together because the defense as a whole wasn't all that good to begin with. But Carolina, at least for the first time in, I would say, 3 years, has actual hope. And I think that's where we start here with the Panthers. There's a reason why they are being mocked defensive players all through mock drafts all over the place. They were the worst in the league against the run. They were the 10th worst against the pass. And because of this, Carolina's going to have to spend some of that $29 million in cap space. That puts them at an unfavorable position. They are 10th from the bottom in terms of that, but at least they're not in the worst spot in their division. Actually, they're in the best spot in their division, if you can believe it, cap space wise. They have the 8th pick in the draft, and pretty much best player available is probably the way to go for Carolina. In terms of their other picks, now, as I do this, I'm going to do this before the trades start becoming official when the league year begins. So all these picks, obviously, I'll talk about trades that may have happened depending on the team in question, but these are as if no trades were done. And Carolina's allotments, they don't have their own second-round pick. That was part of the Caleb Williams debt or the Bryce Young debt on their end. They do have the Rams second. They do have their 3rd and 4th, which is cool. They also have Dallas's 4th because of the Jonathan Mingo trade. I don't know why Dallas made that. Anyway, they have their 5th, the Giants and Ravens 5th, and they have the Niners 7th. So a decent amount of picks, and I'm sure Carolina is going to be a part of the post-draft allotment of picking up guys, undrafted dudes, and they're trying to fill out their roster. But for once, Carolina has a little bit of hope. And like I said, I think it's the first time in 3 years I can say that about the Panthers. Can I say that about the Saints, though? I would probably think not, but I think this bottoming out needed to happen for New Orleans. It didn't start that way. For the first 2 weeks, if you were to tell me that the Saints through 2 weeks were looking like Super Bowl contenders, it'd be hard to disagree. The way they were destroying teams, they destroyed Carolina and then they buried Dallas in back-to-back weeks, almost putting up a hundo in those 2 weeks. And then from there, things went really, really bad. Some of it due to coaching. Dennis Allen did get fired. And some of it due to things just looking horrible on offense or defense when it came to injuries, or in the case of the defense, looking relatively old, to be honest. They lost games they had every business losing because that run defense was really bad and that pass defense was really bad. And Carolina was the only team really worse than them in both realms. The pass defense, technically Jacksonville was worse too, but it was just awful to watch this team play some defense. Derek Carr got hurt, and it showed, their offense showed without him. And Alvin Kamara, though he had some injury issues. Chris Olave had some concussions. Taysom Hill got hurt. Juwan Johnson got hurt. Rashid Shaheed got hurt. So everybody on their offense, no bueno. And the offensive line just wasn't hitting it and wasn't getting it done. Defensively, it's just a mix of a lot of older dudes and a lot of dudes that just haven't really hit in terms of their youth. It's just an awful setup when it came to the Saints. They needed to bottom out in the worst way possible. New Orleans and the cap space situation is in an awful setup. They have the worst cap space in the league, $39.5 million. In terms of their cap space, they are over the cap in this realm. And it feels like that's the case every single year with this Saints team, but it remains the case. They are just awful when it comes to having to kick the can down the road, and they may have to shed some talent. We'll see what New Orleans does there. New Orleans will be picking with the 9th pick in the draft, so right after the Panthers. And like Carolina, there really aren't a lot of moves that they should not make. New Orleans, they can beef up the offensive line. They can try to get anything on defense to help out the still pretty good, but obviously not getting any younger Cameron Jordan, or Demario Davis is still a very good linebacker, or Tyrann Mathieu is still a very good safety. They could use help in all of these realms to help out a really terrible defense. They're going to have some picks, though. They've got their own in the first 3 rounds. They also have the 3rd and 4th from the Commanders in the Marshawn Lattimore trade. They have their own 4th, too. They have their own 6th. They have the Eagles 7th, and they have their own 7th. So that's New Orleans' draft pick allotment. Good value. I think New Orleans could really go to work, especially with those first 4 picks and the first 93 selections. I think New Orleans could do a little bit of damage here and trying to rebuild what needs to be rebuilt, which is a roster that is a mix of getting older and very expensive. So let's see what New Orleans is able to do with this draft pick allotment. So I said after the 2023 season, the most frustrating team in the NFL was the Falcons because they didn't figure it out. Like, are you really going to be bad and all the way bad, or good and somewhat good? They were neither. They were just mediocre. And I think they retained their title, to be honest, because they are mediocre once again. It didn't start that way, though. Kirk Cousins looked pretty good coming off the torn Achilles. He looked efficient. The offense that the Falcons had, they were moving, and things were looking pretty good. And then Kirk Cousins got injured and tried to play through it. He really shouldn't have played through it, and the Falcons season capsized. This is after they swept Tampa Bay and had a commanding lead after the second Bucs game. They even beat Dallas right after that. Everything was cool until we got to Veterans Day weekend. And then things went really bad. How bad, you ask? Well, the Falcons won exactly 2 games after this. The first of which was against a really bad Raider team. The second of which was against a really bad Giants team. Shout out to the Falcons defense for that one. They helped me get to my fantasy championship game with that performance. 2 pick sixes. Well done. Anyway, it was a frustrating end to what could have been a good season for the Falcons, in part because Kirk Cousins got hurt and they went to Michael Penix too late. Mike Penix showed that he's got some flashes. He's got some skill and ability. He's still got to work out the rookie stuff, but Mike Penix showed that he can be decent. Drake London showed he can be wide receiver 1. They've got 2 monsters at running back. Their offensive line's still pretty good. That pass rush, though, it's bad. It doesn't exist. That was even with Matt Judon, which that was highly disappointing. That their pass rush is just awful and remains that way. It may be coaching. I don't know what to tell them, but it's just awful. It cannot stick for Atlanta to be better going forward. Statistically speaking for the Falcons, there's some good and bad here. The good is the offense. It was top 10. They were really good with running the ball. That would explain why B.J. Robinson had 1,400 yards. They were really good at throwing the ball. That would explain why Drake London had 1,200 yards. Even Kyle Pitts got involved and Tyler Algier got involved. It was just a very solidly functioning offense, whether it was a healthy Kirk Cousins or a kind of getting into the rhythm Michael Penix. And Penix obviously going to be QB1 going forward. Atlanta didn't look as stupid as we all thought they did for picking Penix after signing Cousins. Except for the dead cat money they may have to eat with the Cousins stuff. Anyway, the bad came with the defense. They were bottom 10 in terms of points. They were bottom 10 in terms of yards. It was not great. They didn't do all that well against the pass. They were actually mediocre against the run, so at least there's that. And as I mentioned with the sack totals from earlier, Arnold Ebiketie led the team with 6. Matt Judon had a disappointing 5.5, which is a little surprising, considering he terrorized AFC East quarterbacks when he was in New England, and North Flint and Baltimore. Atlanta, in terms of their salary cap situation, not in a great spot, but it's not Saints bad. They are third from the bottom in terms of their salary cap space, $5.2 million over the cap, but that's a couple of restructures could fix that easily. They, or cutting Kirk Cousins, which feels either inevitable or they'll have them restructure. They'll figure it out, I think, before the league year begins. I don't think Atlanta's going to be cap strapped for very long. They also have their own picks in the first 5 rounds, which includes the 15th pick. That's the punishment you get for not picking a lane, whether to be all the way bad or make the playoffs. And they have the Rams 7th. They don't have their own 6th, and they don't have their own 7th. So that's where Atlanta is in terms of where they could be. It feels like the Falcons aren't far off if the defense can get right. Jesse Bates has advertised. We need the rest of the defense to try to get up to his level. And now to the winners of this division, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who were steady and then eventually got it together and eventually got it right. And that's not a bad thing. They were Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans got to 1,000, and they actually got some good ground game production from Bucky Irving, and Tampa Bay's offense was rolling despite the injury to Chris Godwin. They were overall a very productive unit on that realm. Defensively, yikes, not great, kind of very bad aside from the defensive line. I don't really like their defensive line so much with Kalijah Kancey, Yaya Diaby, and of course the big man in the middle, Vita Vea, who is terrifying when it comes to him getting at full speed. He is like that. It's a little surprising. Tampa Bay, believe it or not, had the 3rd best offense in the league in terms of yardage. They were, like I mentioned before, just productive because Baker Mayfield had his best season, I would say statistically. They were 3rd in passing, also really good. Now, they've held it down as the worst rushing team in the league over the last few years. They are not bad. As a matter of fact, way better than that. Like I mentioned before, Tampa Bay's offense was very good. They were 4th in rushing. Again, Bucky Irving, Rachaad White. They were very good. Like Tampa Bay's offense got it together. Their offensive line's a little tricky, not named Tristan Wirfs, but it's a good unit. Overall, no real complaints on the offensive side of the ball. And points-wise, like I said, very good. They were 4th in the league in points. They knew what they were doing on that realm. Now, Todd Bowles is a defensive coach. Their defense leaves some things to be desired. Kind of mid-tier in terms of the... At points, they look kind of bad as well. I would say slightly below average in terms of total yardage, which... Okay, cool, you make the playoffs off your offense. Cool, fine. They, unfortunately, were 4th from the bottom against the pass. That can't be good. And when it comes to against the run, well, they should actually be good. They were actually 4th from the best. So, kind of just balanced out, I guess you could say. They were really bad against the run, against the pass, I should say. They were really good against the run. And that defensive line is, I think, the signature reason for the run part of this. And points-wise, and though it looked kind of bad in some games because Lamar Jackson carved them up and Kirk Cousins carved them up, they were mid-tier at points as well. So I think if we've learned anything about the Bucs this year, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the mediocre of times. And that's kind of how Tampa Bay operated. Okay, cool, fine. In terms of their salary cap, they have the least amount of cap space for a team that's under the cap at this moment in time. They are 28th in the league in terms of cap space. They have $5.2 million in the black, if you will. They also are going to have picks. Tampa Bay, as a matter of fact, is the 19th pick. They did win their division, but were the only home team to lose in round 1. They have their own picks in every round but the 6th. It's kind of straightforward for the Bucs, who, to be honest, need to get that defense right and get that defense together. The offense, generally good, and not much needs to really change here. Tweak a few things every now and again and try to replace Chris Godwin, who may or may not come back due to his free agency status. But aside from that, Tampa Bay's in a pretty good spot here. And that's where this video will conclude. The Bucs hold it down in the NFC South, and I guess it's going to be a matter of, can Atlanta try to close the gap or catch them like they should have stayed ahead of them this past year? And what happens with New Orleans and Carolina? They've got work to do. Both those teams do. Coming up next will be the only other division to not see a playoff win from it. It's actually the best division from the regular season last year, the Division of Doom, aka the NFC North. We're going to find out where all 4 of those teams go from here. Chicago, you will be the first stop of my next train of thought.